good turnout for a cold night. So I appreciate everybody coming in, making time for this. I know there's a lot of things going on for students, and just for people that have families. So really appreciate everybody coming out tonight. Thank you. My name is Ben Birch, and I coordinate recovery services here at the College of St. Scholastica. I work with Ted Nielsen in back. Our program supports students in recovery. So what we do is we work with those students that have gotten sober for one reason or another and are now looking to engage college. So we work with some really incredible kids that have really incredible stories, and it says a lot about St. Scholastica to make this a priority in terms of our strategic initiatives as an institution. I'd like to thank the different groups that helped put this event on tonight. Our marketing department gave us a little push. College communications got us some play in the paper and on TV, and all of that helps spread the word of what's going on up here. I'd also like to give a shout out to Eric Faust and the Duluth Coffee Company. They've graciously supplied coffee for these events, and well, that's worth something, right? I'd also like to thank our sponsors that have helped out here. First of all, specifically the Hazelden Foundation, who have underwritten the expenses of this evening. But we also want to mention the Duluth Bethel, a strong partner for St. Scholastica, the CLEAN program. Dennis Cummings and his staff have been extremely supportive of what we're doing, and we see this as just the beginning of a strong relationship, doing some really neat outreach over the upcoming months. And also, there's just a number of private donors that give money, time, support that keeps things like this going for our community. So I just wanted to mention all of them. So I'm very excited to introduce tonight's speaker. I met Ken about a year ago at a small networking event in the Twin Cities. Not only was his presentation on the adolescent brain fascinating, but his wit made the information seem a little less intimidating. When the committee I was working with this year on the series first met, we put Ken's name on the short list of potential speakers. I looked into securing him and realized that he is a pretty big deal within this area of study. So our friends at Hazelden did step up and have paid him handsomely to be here this evening.
They have?
They have. And I believe that our community should feel quite lucky to have Ken with us tonight. He gets a lot of invitations. He can kind of cherry pick them, but he knew that he wanted to be in Duluth in late January, so I give him credit for that. So now a bit about Ken. Ph.D., he's the director of the Center for Adolescent Substance Abuse Research and an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Minnesota. He received his BA from the University of Minnesota and a Ph.D. in psychology, clinical psychology, from the State University of New York at Stony Brook. His research interests include the assessment and treatment of adolescent drug abuse and the prevalence and can you help me with that word? Etiology, I'm sorry. I graduated from UMD. Etiology of problem gambling. Dr. Winters has published several assessment tools and numerous articles in the area of adolescent substance abuse and pathological gambling. He is on the editorial board of the Journal of Child and Adolescent Substance Abuse, is an associate editor for the Journal of Gambling Studies, and is a consultant to many organizations, including the Hennepin County Community Prevention Coalition, the Hazelden Foundation, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, the World Health Organization, and the Mentor Foundation. His previous experience includes appointments as a psychology research scientist at Stony Brook and a staff psychologist at a community mental health center. With all that, please help me welcome Dr. Ken Winters.
Thank you, Ben. That's a very thoughtful introduction. I appreciate it. He set the bar too high. He should have said, hey, he came from the Twin Cities, drove up today. He's a good guy. He's going to give a talk. It'd be a little easier, but I have to thank Ted. Where's Ted? Ted's way in the back. Appreciate the wonderful time Ted spent with me a couple hours already today showing me Duluth, telling me stories about Ben over dinner, and had a nice time. So I've enjoyed it. I did look at the calendar when Ben said, we want to come up here in January. I usually, maybe even when you live in Duluth, you don't try to go too far north in the middle of winter. So for me to go a little far north from where I live was a little stretch, but what the heck. It's, yeah, I think it's only 1 degree difference where I left, and it's a nice drive today with the sun out. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. So I have a lot in this talk. It's a little bit like a hitchhiker's guide to working with teenagers that have a drug and other problem. I call it that because I go kind of fast, like hitchhiking, and you're in a car and you're zooming along and you see some things that you might like to stop, and you don't have time. You just have to take a quick look and keep on moving. And so that's a bit, I think, how this talk unfolds, but I'm trying to cover a lot. So hang in there. You can get a copy of the slide presentation if you'd like. There's my email's at the last slide. Feel free, be more than happy to share that. And then there is time for discussion at the end, so we can drill down into some specifics if you feel so inclined. So the first slide is a reflection of the main theme of the talk, drug abuse for teenagers, as well as adults in many ways, but for teens for sure it rarely occurs in isolation. There's usually other problems that are co-occurring or coexisting. Many times these other problems are the biggest problem, or the bigger one, and the drug use might just be a symptom of something else. So we have a lot of treatment programs for drug abuse, and we have drug counselors, and we have drug treatment programs, and it's a good idea for those systems and those individuals to know a lot about other issues and disorders, because it's likely that those are central to somebody's health and to getting better. So it's a clinically oriented talk. I didn't think there'd be parents here, well, I'm sure there are parents here, but I didn't think just parents would come because they'd be interested about the drug use in their home by a teenager. So I did angle it towards those working in the field, service providers, whether you're public health, nurse, psychologist, I don't think we have any psychiatrists here, chemical dependency counselor. So it's fairly clinical, but a lot of sidebars that aren't so heavy. There's a little neuroscience. As Ben mentioned, I occasionally give a teen brain talk. But I'm not a neuroscientist by training. So actually that's good news, because when I go down that road, I'm not going to get that technical, because I have to give you the talk at a level I can understand it at, which is pretty layperson's. The bad news is you might ask a good neuroscience question, I won't know the answer. So we'll ask our UMD graduate, Ben, to help us out, or others. But with emails, we can share communication. I can find someone to help us with the answer. That last slide was some resources, and many of them are cost items, but there's a lot of good resources out there if you want to learn and get some more background on this topic. So I organized the talk around 6 themes, 6 habits of highly effective professionals when working with teenagers that have a drug problem and another coexisting behavioral or mental disorder. So the so-called co-occurring disorders is a big theme, and I'm going to walk you through how I think we've learned a lot from science that helps you working with teenagers, clinicians, service providers, or even those in prevention. So I've organized around 6 themes. A couple of them take a long time, and then a couple of them are pretty short. All right, first one. Let me get a sip here, because this is a long one. I got to get ready for this. It's, of course, a no-brainer if you work with teenagers. It is important to have a good developmental understanding of young people. Now, we have a lot of young people here, so for some of you, it's just kind of reflecting on what you were like 2 years ago. For someone like me, you forget what it was like to be a teenager, and then you start to raise teens, and you can't understand why they act the way they do, and you later realize they're just acting the way you did as a teenager. But there's a lot of interesting new emerging science that helps us further sharpen our understanding of teenagers, why they act the way they do, and it isn't just hormones, it isn't just MTV, it isn't just cultural. There's a lot of interesting other biological phenomena going on. But one principle when it comes to teenage behavior and drug use is that often teenage normal behavior can look like a teenager might be having a problem with drugs. So you can see changes that mimic drug use. And they might falsely lead us to believe a teenager has a problem when it really might just be a teenager being him or her normal self and going through very important adaptive stages. So an example of it comes from DSM-5. You may know of a disorder called borderline personality disorder. Very serious chronic problem. This is the 9 criteria from the latest edition of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the official manual for diagnosis. It comes from Psychiatry Arena. So these 9 up here, we read those and looked at them and said, my goodness, these 9 look kind of familiar. They look like what we see as lists of features that we've warned parents about to learn how to handle typical teenage stuff and don't go overboard and don't over-pathologize because it's normal teenage things. And we saw this list of the 9 criteria for borderline. We thought, my goodness, there's a lot of similarity. I've even highlighted, I thought the 7 out of 9, it really looked like an overlap. I'm going to get a little closer. Yes, frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. Being scared that a boyfriend or girlfriend has left you or that the peer group you're with is going to desert you because something happened in a given day. A pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships. Sounds familiar? Identity disturbance, impulsivity in at least 2 areas. Affective instability, chronic feelings of emptiness. Now, maybe not chronic emptiness as a teen, but one can feel empty. Inappropriate, intense anger or difficulty controlling anger. I'd make a case all of those, to some degree, are part of being a teenager. Now, clinically, it rises to the level of a borderline when it happens severely and frequently and not just part of temporary teen years. So, a good diagnostician can separate the two. And I'm not suggesting that the borderline experts have got it wrong. I don't think that's true. This is a real serious syndrome here when you meet these criteria at a clinical level. But the teen years can display behaviors that can look like a lot of problems, including drug use. Okay, the second point I want to raise regarding developmental features reminds us that the teen brain is under significant development during the teen years. And this development is important for how we understand teenage behavior. This science brought kind of a news bulletin to the scene. The science suggests that the brain continues to develop significantly until about age 25. So that was a news bulletin. People thought by age 12 or 13 everything was in place, and hormones and other things kicked in that might lead to some interesting interpretations of where the behavior comes from or how biology might dictate behavior. But it looks like brain development might be also an important feature. 25 is kind of an interesting age, I think. A quiz for the group. There is one right or privilege in America that doesn't kick in until 25. Now, a lot kicks in at 16, 18, and 21, right? 16, we got a lot, driving, some emancipation. 18, of course, voting, military, other emancipation rights, etc. 21, the big one, of course, is drinking. 18 also is gambling and smoking. You know, some of the vices occur anyway, but something doesn't kick in until 25. There we go. Got some experts, maybe some 24-year-olds here that still will be boxed out. So kind of interesting. There are not neuroscientists at Havis and Hertz that told them that. They just looked at the data, and it turns out, at least in modern times, American youth were not very good drivers until about 25. At least to the point where the car industry wants to let you use their car. Of course, parents are okay, and when they're smart, they let you get to 16. Kind of kidding. But kind of interesting that brain development and one aspect of culture has intersected. This is a time-lapse representation of brain maturation. You can see as things are getting blue, what's happening here is there's a sculpting going on It's called synaptic refinement, but the bottom line is the brain is kind of forming its stable shape. And it's doing it at the neuronal level, so you're actually losing some neurons and strengthening neurons that you've already used. But the reason I'm showing this is that the brain matures differentially across regions of the brain. So some regions of the brain mature faster than others during the teen years. And the part of the brain that's relatively last to mature is right here, called the prefrontal cortex, where you exert your biggest, heaviest lifting for judgments, where you delay gratification, resist impulses, you do your multitasking, you weigh pros and cons, consider negative versus positive consequences. You learn how to use context and emotion not to dominate your thinking, etc., etc. Called the seat of sober second thought, the prefrontal cortex. So if you say on second thought a lot, that's good. That means you're using your prefrontal cortex. If you hear a teenager say on second thought, that's really good news because it's relatively hard for him or her to do that. I tell parents, teach your kids on second thought skills and even start to use that language in the home. Model that, etc. So what's maturing earlier? The fun parts of your brain, motivation, emotion, parts of the brain needed for motor coordination. So playing video games is perfect for the teen brain because you have enough dexterity to play the games, and the games are all, of course, revved up with emotion because you're killing people and running over people and et cetera, et cetera. You're getting all jacked up on the wonderful violence and Grand Theft Auto type games. Perfect for the teen brain because it loves that. The brain's excited, and there's even you're trying to set the brain in an exciting state because the brain is primed for that. As you mature, you don't need the video games as much. You need NFL football on Sundays just for 3 hours, and that might be enough for you. You don't need video games endlessly. We all like excitement, and the brain still likes it, but the notion is that the teen years, it's dominating a bit more at the exclusion of reason, at the exclusion of thoughtful, planful thinking. Video games over crossword puzzles. Spending time with friends out and about at the mall or racing around or out and about drinking as opposed to staying at home and reading or watching a movie. These kinds of things can play out when we think about teen brain development. So here's a list, 1 through 8. This is my summary slide on teen brain development for you. These are tendencies that likely emerge during the teen years. Likely do, or maybe having an impact by brain development. So if you read the list, you can see it tends to show biases and things that we might like to do more in the teen years. Novelty seeking is a high priority. Social information, very important. Not so interested in negative consequences, probably more attuned to positive consequences. Emotionality, not the best at controlling it, etc. The last one, take risk and show impulsiveness. Now that's an important one, might be the most important thing, and that gets talked a lot about. And it might be related to some things we're going to talk about downstream with drug use, decision making. Taking risk, though, is not all bad. And I don't want to over-pathologize that. Good risk-taking can lead to wonderful skill building, trying new things, developing new skills, stretching one's talents, and learning to lead an independent life. Because part of adolescence is going from dependence to independence, and that takes some risk. So risk-taking in the teen brain can be used in our favor, and clinicians want to try to corral that and steer that tendency for teenagers towards good risk and away from the bad risk. Risk-taking is also quite normative. It's probably a trait that you carry throughout your life, and we vary in that trait. Some of us are low-end risk takers, some in the middle, some at the high end. I'm probably at the middle to low end. I'm not that big a risk taker. I can't give you any great spicy stories of my youth where my teen brain ran amok and my risk-taking ran wild. I might have ran around with scissors, maybe a little bit, stopped, probably would have put it down. If I had some Wall Street hedge fund managers, I'd love to talk to them about their teen years. I gotta believe they are at the high end, outliers, you know, the 99 percentile of risk taking. They've probably had that trait all their life. They've learned how to hone it for a very practical skill that's been very successful for them. So my hunch is they've understood risk. But in the teen years, I gotta believe, well, maybe that prefrontal cortex wasn't working all that well, and that risk-taking trait might have led to some interesting stories. Also, teenagers are not impaired with understanding risk. So it's not cognitive deficit. It looks like context is and emotionality is the issue. So teenagers understand the danger with most risk situations at the same level adults do. Not every risk situation. Some risk decisions or perceptions by teenagers with drugs are perhaps out of kilter with reality. But in a lot of situations, teenagers will be equivalent to us adults on how to understand risk. But it's context and emotionality that tends to make a bigger impact during the teen years on whether you're going to take risk or not as opposed to an adult. And the big thing that's been shown in the literature, both with controlled and anecdotal, is driving. When you're driving by yourself or driving with friends. So as adults, you're better able to not let the person or the activity or the excitement of those in the car with you impact your driving decisions and your driving behavior as an adult. As a teenager, you're not so good at that. The emotionality and the context screws up your head and it leads to poor driving decisions. It's not just practice. You might think, well, yeah, adults are driving for more years than practice. It's not just that. They've been able to control for that in some of these studies. In fact, when a teenager is by him or herself in a car, they are equivalent in driving skill as an adult. So take a naive driver and an experienced driver, and you don't throw in emotionality in the bad context, so they're doing just fine on the roads. So we could give cars to teenagers at 16 safely if we knew they never screwed up by having friends, having loud music, having intoxication, or all the things that screw up their driving. But there's nothing about being a 16-year-old and the motor skill needed that creates the driving problem. It's the other factors. We get older, we're able to do a better job. We either don't let that context come into play or we're just better at blocking it. So poor Ted had to deal with me as he's driving around Duluth earlier today because I'm asking all kinds of questions about his life, about the program, about Duluth, and he's negotiating all kinds of ice. He's negotiating the uphills, the downhills, cars coming at us. He's doing a great job. He's able to block out enough and still hang in there. But if Ted were 16, and I was trying that, it might have been a little different. So the teen years is a bit risky for drug use. This is just one slide to show it. The highest bar is to the left. The 15 to 18-year-olds, 15 to 20 is the bar to the left. That has the highest prevalence rate of alcohol dependence. This is based on national data. And then what do you notice? The bars are lower as you get older age groups. So the youth years is likely a time where you're going to use chemicals the most and you're going to have the highest probability of showing abuse or dependent symptoms. A lot of us grow out of it. It's not fate that even if you have dependent symptoms as a teenager, you'll have that later, but it is a high-risk time. Okay, point number 3 about related to developmental themes is, remember I'm still on just habit number 1, but we're in some sub-points here. Point number 3 is it is common for other disorders to occur when a teenager is getting into problems with drugs. These are some of the common ones: conduct disorder, ADHD, depression, anxiety. I've got some prevalence rates up there, some general rates. The other disorders don't have rates next to them because there are not enough studies yet to give us good, precise estimates. But the odds are a teenager that meets a clinical definition of a substance use disorder will have at least one other mental or behavioral disorder, and a very appreciable percent will have 2 or more. Little sidebar. So why do we have drug abuse and other disorders coexist? What's the theory behind it? The literature discusses 3 types of possible pathways, the dysregulation model, self-medication, and vulnerability to stress. I don't want to go through all those in great depth. They're interesting theories. There's evidence for all three. I think there's a strong evidence basis for the dysregulation one. I'm just trying to show you with this slide up here. This slide reflects the notion that you have a lot of teenagers that start out with childhood risk factors, often reflected by impulsivity in early childhood. Do everyone know what the marshmallow test is? You can give it to very young individuals, children, preschoolers. You put some marshmallows on a table, you tell the toddler to sit there, and you tell the toddler if they could avoid taking any of the marshmallows, you, the adult, are going to give them more. So you tell the youngster, you know, there's some marshmallows there, but if you can hold off on eating any of them, I'm going to give you some more soon. The adult leaves the room. The child doesn't know this until this happens. And then you videotape and see what happens. And so kids with poor impulse control, I can't resist it, they're eating the marshmallows and coming up with great stories about what happened to the marshmallow when the adult comes back. But, so there's variability that shows up, can show up early. Youngsters with this poor impulse control, they have a higher risk of developing, when they hit the late childhood, early teen years, ADHD or conduct disorder. When you have those problems emerge, often then drug use occurs or is subsequent. That often is in reaction to the problems you're having with attention and conduct, because you're either a sensation seeker or you have attention problems, so the drug use helps to address that. So it's a little bit of a medication issue. And then the drug use itself can even contribute to an exacerbation of the conduct problem or the ADHD. So early risk factors, you get a comorbid disorder emerging, drug use kicks in, and then the drug use also further potentiates the problem. I'm going to skip that because I just mentioned it. One more sidebar. How about the other direction? Could drug use contribute to the onset of mental illness? So this is something debated in the literature a lot. That is, let's say you don't have the pre-existing condition, but you then start to use drugs, and then does something else kick in? Could it cause or at least contribute? So what are the data on that? This is correlational data. So it's flawed. I'm already going to tell you, it's flawed. You've got to be careful not to overinterpret it. But it was a study published by the federal government. This shows a relationship of having an adult serious mental illness as a function of how early you started using marijuana. So the way you read this, go right to the left bar. You see 21% on the top, and below it less than 12. So in this national survey, among individuals that said they started using marijuana age 12 or younger, 21% of them had an adult problem with mental illness, a serious mental illness, schizophrenia, psychosis, or bipolar. Not ADHD or conduct, but serious mental illness in those categories. So, and then you can see how the rate of adult problem decreased as a function of waiting later to use marijuana. So reflects marijuana might have a contributory role, but it's correlational. We don't know what other risk factors might have been lurking that caused the mental illness, and maybe using marijuana was just a proxy marker of other things going on with the person. So very correlational, can't assume causality. You have to do longitudinal studies to figure out if there's more causal relationship. People are starting to do those studies now because these data are provocative. One other data set that's not so correlational, it is provocative. This is showing how the onset of an illness could be impacted by your use of substances. So this is a study of looking at people that all had a serious mental illness, a psychosis, schizophrenia, psychotic disorder, bipolar. And they charted when they started using drugs and when did their psychosis onset, at what age. So there's three things. People already have the psychosis, and then they're asking, well, when did you first notice the psychosis symptoms onsetting, at what age, and what's your drug use history pattern? So they're intersecting those three, and these are the data. The bar in the middle is the most provocative. It's the marijuana bar, and above it says 2.7. That means that among individuals that said they used cannabis when they were a teenager, the onset of their disorder, psychosis, occurred 2.7 years earlier than the group of psychosis people that didn't use cannabis. Now they're comparing drug use, non-drug use, and onset. Almost 3 years earlier onset of those that use cannabis, of the disorder. So a lot of people had the disorder that didn't use cannabis, that makes sense. And it's likely those that had the earlier onset would have still had the disorder if they hadn't used cannabis. They were at risk for it probably, but it might have altered the trajectory of their onset. So that's bad news in a lot of ways, not just because you might have the disorder for 3 more years if you use cannabis. But if you have, anytime you have a disorder in the earlier onsets, the likelihood is that it will have a worse course for you throughout your life and that you'll be more resistant to treatment. If you're going to have a disorder in life, and if there's a way you can delay its onset, the more you can delay it, the likely is it's not going to be as severe for you, and it's likely you're going to be able to respond better to treatment. And of course, then the reverse, all negative, occurs if it occurs earlier. So marijuana might have altered the trajectory for these individuals. The pro-alcohol people could have comfort here, the beverage industry would like this data. This alcohol didn't do anything. This isn't statistically significant. So alcohol didn't have any role in trajectory. Marijuana did. A slide that you could think about if somebody ever tells you alcohol and marijuana are equally harmful. Or cannabis, marijuana is not any more harmful than alcohol. I've always debated that on many levels, and this is one new data point I raise and say, hold on a second. Might not be so simple. Anyway, okay. So a lot of developmental concepts throughout that. So let me get to number 2. This is just a basic principle that treatment for drug abuse and its coexisting disorders can work. We're getting better at figuring out what to do to make it work for more kids than less, and how we can make it work more optimally and more quickly. But the basic principle is it can work. There's a lot of treatment approaches for drug abuse. They run the gamut. I've got up here 6 main approaches. The first 5 are so-called psychosocial or behavioral. One of them is 12-step, and then there's pharmacotherapy is getting used and discussed in the drug abuse treatment arena. A little bit about this literature. So there were 6 I just showed you. No single or individual treatment approach looks like is winning the horse race. Although the perfect studies haven't been done, or at least the ideal studies haven't been done yet. But it doesn't look like any single approach is clearly heads above the other. However, when people have looked at the data, it appears that if you have a program and you could put in motivational enhancement or motivational interviewing techniques, cognitive behavioral therapy, and have a family component, you're probably including the best ingredients to make your program optimal. But there's still a lot of data to be done to figure that out. If you're going to have a disorder that needs medication, if you're treating a disorder that looks like may respond to medication, it also can behoove you to try to get that person to receive behavioral concomitant treatment as well. Medication alone, for most of the mental and behavioral disorders for teenagers, doesn't work as well as if you can combine the medication with good counseling. So the combo is a plus. Kids get better when they learn better coping skills and have more social supports, perhaps not a news bulletin. For teenagers that are getting treatment for drug abuse, big predictors are getting connected to a self-help group, whether it's formal in the community as an AA base, or whether it's just getting and building a self-help safety net for yourself among your friends and your family. And also it helps to treat the coexisting disorder. So teenagers that have drug abuse, and likely they're going to have at least one other coexisting. If they get care for that coexisting, that's a big plus. This is a data slide just to document that. The yellow bars are higher than the orange bars. That's because the yellow bars represent the teenagers in these studies that got treatment for both the psychiatric problem and the drug abuse problem. The orange bars, which are a little lower, those are the teenagers that only got treatment for the drug abuse problem. These are abstinence rates, so the higher the bar, the better. So I thought I'd focus in on 2 of the 6. Since I'm in Minnesota, let's talk about 12-step. Makes sense? So for teenagers, what do we make of it? Well, it is a predominant form of treatment in teenagers in America. It's very predominant in Minnesota. But by best estimates, about 2/3 of treatment programs for adolescent drug abuse at least are in part based on the 12-step model, by best estimates. It's hard to do this kind of study because there's not an easy cataloging of the lay of the land of treatment programs. But for efforts, rigorous efforts have been made. It looks like it is a common approach. But most programs are multimodal, so they don't just do 12 steps. They also weave in family, they weave in cognitive behavioral, and many of them use motivational enhancement. So is the 12-step working for teens? It's a weak science. Sussman looked at the science. He found 19 studies that he thought he at least could collected some decent outcome data. And for many of those studies, they did compare 12-step to a no treatment control group. And for the ones that had that comparison, that was rare. It's tough to do that kind of study nowadays. Ethically, it's really hard to pull that off. But for the studies that had that luxury, the AA program, the 12-step, did better than the no treatment control. That isn't something you brag too much about when you want to advance the validity of a treatment program. You better do better than no treatment. Does it do better than family or CBT or et cetera? That's the more relevant horse race. And I wish I could tell you there's data on that yet. There isn't. We haven't done those kind of studies. Very expensive, and I'm not sure how we're going to go that route. What about 12-step in teens? Here are some things that are challenging, though. It can be difficult to convince a teenager that they might have a lifelong disease and they need to now rearrange their life and think about changes in their life that are lifelong. That's difficult. The teen brain isn't necessarily going to resonate to lifelong concepts. Some teenagers are not all that socially inclined, and the 12-step approach probably works the best for individuals that have a modicum of social skills, or at least they feel like they can readily connect socially. Not only, I think you benefit with primary treatment in a 12-step when you have social skills because you're engaged in the group process and the one-on-one counseling, but it probably also is a big plus when you're trying to develop that social support network after treatment. Some self-help groups are not that teen-friendly. They can be dominated by older individuals. Many young women complain of getting hit on by way too many men because it becomes a very uncomfortable situation. Too often the themes are old boys' stories and just don't connect and don't resonate to young people. So it can be difficult. I think Minnesota, we get lucky. We have a lot of self-help groups, and we have a lot of treatment programs. So I know a lot of young adults, at least, can find reasonable self-help groups that they think are appropriate for them in the Twin Cities. So you got a reasonably big metro area, you got a big recovery community. But my goodness, that's a luxury to have in the Twin Cities. Think about most of the rest of the country wouldn't fit those features. So here's a fantasy of mine. This is not a real 12-step program, but it's my fantasy that someday there'll be a 12-step program that'll be really directed at helping that teen brain. So I'm calling 12 steps of self-regulation. And we came up with 12. These are all adjectives or descriptors of how you might help somebody do better at decision-making, slow down, not impulsive. There were some redundant ones up here. To make the bit work, we had to come up with 12. I didn't want to say a 9-step program. That doesn't. So, but it's my way of saying I'm really encouraged by a lot of treatment programs and new models that are looking at how to get the teen brain to do a better job with its executive functioning, how to get it better at sober second thought. So 12-step programs that include mindfulness training. It's getting more common, for example. 12-step programs that are including cognitive behavioral therapy approaches for better decision making. That's getting more And then I thought I'd just mention pharmacotherapy because it is probably a peek into the future. The use of medications for all behavioral mental disorders is skyrocketing. It's just unbelievable. The talk therapy is not in a bull market anymore. It's having to compete against where the money and the models are going and the training. It's what medications and how are we going to get better medications for people. And so a lot of research studies also are, let's better develop medications. More so than let's better develop talk therapies. It is a bit frustrating when you're on my side of the fence, because I'm on the talk therapy side. I'm not a physician. Is there pharmacotherapy for drug abuse and for the adolescent disorders? Yes. So this is a slide to remind us that we are treating drug addiction with medications. It's not prevalent yet, but there's a lot out there for tobacco, for the opioids, and for other drugs. And these medications either block the effects of the psychoactive effects of the drug, they help reduce the cravings, or their replacement. The replacement is giving somebody a watered-down version of a drug that you were addicted to in the hopes that you can get drug-free by titrating yourself with a watered-down version. Or, for some, it's the lifelong medicine you would take. So some might be taking methadone for the rest of their life. It's a mild, very mild version of heroin. It doesn't create the same brain hijacking as the street version. And it may serve a lifelong purpose for such individuals. Not a lot yet with teenagers or young adults, but I can already see people starting to study it and see if it's safe and effective, because I think the field is seeing the tilting and wondering if we need to at least figure out what might work with teenagers. There are a lot of medications used for teenagers and the other problems they have. So many of the typical drugs used to treat depression, ADHD, anxiety in adults, we also use them for teenagers. I thought I would just have one more sidebar on the ADHD medication drug abuse risk story. So ADHD is onset of childhood. It can run a course through adolescence and young adulthood. For some individuals, it then burns out and shows a desistance of symptoms, but for some it doesn't. We kiddingly thought we had a prominent person in Minnesota for which their childhood ADHD did not desist, and his name was Jesse Ventura. We thought Jesse had ADHD as a kid, and he was showing those symptoms as an adult as he was trying to deal with being a governor. But anyways, but there is a concern. If we give psychostimulant medication, which is a form of amphetamines, to an individual with ADHD as a child, does that prime the pump or increase their risk for drug abuse later in life? So it's a logical question. You're giving a drug that's addictive to treat a problem, but does that create another problem? And it looks like the evidence is in the good news direction, that it doesn't create a generation of addicted individuals, and that the ADHD is getting treated with medicine, and at the level that you're given the psychostimulant medications, it's working at a therapeutic level and not creating the addiction hijacking process. I'm going to also just remind us all, recovery schools is a wonderful way to extend the benefits of treatment. So it's great that I'm in the backyard of one of the recovery college programs. They are in yellow. The ones in red are high schools. There's a lot of yellow and red in the state of Minnesota. We have more per capita than other states. Unfortunately, high schools are starting to get closed and the colleges are expanding. But it's a great model. It makes sense. You got an individual that's having to live in an environment or spend a lot of their day in an environment where the context might not be favorable for staying sober or clean, and a school environment that can optimize recovery principles and build assets and help with the risk and the triggers surely makes a lot of sense when somebody's trying to renegotiate their life and change some habits. So number 3, there is a big movement that you might have a great treatment model, and I showed you 6. Remember that slide that said treatment programs run the gamut, and I gave you 6 options? Well, you can deliver a manualized, good program to a lot of clients, and you might have great success. But you're missing out on perhaps not personalizing that treatment when you need to. You might be able to actually extend the effectiveness of treatment, a good model, by realizing there's ways you can adapt it and tweak it or personalize it. It's similar to how people with 2 disorders, they have the same disorder, but one might take one medicine, one might take another. It just turns out one responds well to one type of an antidepressant and one responds to another type. So we need to think about that when we apply our talk therapies, our counseling techniques to our clients. And there's a lot of ways I think we can think about it when we're dealing with teenagers. So we talk about what are teen-friendly approaches and strategies. And we think there's 2 of them that are very helpful for treating drug abuse and other disorders that are very teen-friendly. So not only do I like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and motivational enhancement because the literature says it works for drug use, but I also think they work for the teen brain. So why is that? Well, here's my blurb on CBT, which stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. So read those 2 bullets while I take a sip of water. I think those 2 bullets represent the core features of CBT. And I think when you realize who's receiving it, a teenager that likes immediate solutions, that likes things to be concrete, isn't too interested in the abstract, wants solutions that work readily, not a person who's necessarily want to extend the therapy process. They're an MTV generation after all. I think CBT fits the bill. So it's practical, it's concrete, and it works on building skills that the teenager can use right away to address real problems. It might be the teenager has an underlying Oedipus conflict with a parent. I'm not saying that isn't possible, but to get a teenager to engage in the lengthy, abstract psychodynamic therapy to deal with that is going to be rare for most teenagers. Not that they can't work on that later when they get a little older and they have the time and the wherewithal. Motivational interviewing we like because it is not adult-centered. And the idea is with motivational interviewing, it's very client-centered. And so that gives the teenager power and control. It empowers the teenager to help direct where the counseling goes, and it doesn't put the onus on the adult to do all the work. You have to remember, to some degree, I'm being a little facetious here, but to some degree, as an adult counselor to a teenager, we represent the enemy. Teenagers are trying to individuate and separate from adults, and they're doing it as a natural phenomenon. It's a healthy adjustment because they need to eventually live independently and be out on their own. So they're psychologically pushing themselves away from adults, and here we are as a therapist, as an adult, trying to tell them what to do and to try to win them over with our views of the world. So motivational interviewing doesn't take that tactic. If you're good at it, you will steer the teenager towards good goals, but you do it in a way that brings the teenager in as a partnership in the therapy process. This is a little too lengthy. I'm going to go right to here just to remind you that motivational interviewing is a great skill. If you can take classes or workshops on it, I encourage it. It's at one level, it's very rich and deep. On another level, it's relatively simple. It's kind of similar to being a good listener and trying to be as best you can a kinder, gentler advice giver. So you're not forceful, you're not dogmatic, you're not harsh, you roll with resistance, you pull back when you're seeing your client isn't interested, and you just figure out clever ways to buy the person in to behavior change. And so these are 5 descriptors of how it's done. But I encourage you to do some reading on it, take courses. It's also a great skill to use in life in general. I wish I had better skills with it when I was a grad student, as I had to negotiate stuff with my advisor about where to go with this, that, and the other thing. It's great in the workplace. Employees can benefit by with their employee when they're having to talk about tough stuff. Of course, if you're a parent, it's great. We're doing a project trying to teach parents these skills to help with problems they're having with their children at home. Also, we think both CBT and motivation interviewing are perfect for helping to teach skills. So remember my list of 12, I've just now got 5 here. Both of these techniques can easily plug in, so you can teach teenagers some key skills. And these are skills up here we think are helpful for leading a healthy lifestyle, but they can also be helpful for treating depression, anxiety, ADHD. Okay, number 4, treatment should match intensity. You may appreciate the fact that some people come to the clinical setting and they have mild problems, mild, moderate problems. It makes sense then to do a brief intervention. Brief is maybe 2 or 3 sessions. Sometimes you can do a brief intervention in 1 session. And there's some good models out there. Guess what approaches they use a lot? Motivational interviewing and cognitive behavioral therapy are typical strategies. They're within these brief interventions. Some of us get brief interventions when a physician looks at our medical record and says, you have to stop, you have to lose, you have to, your blood level is this, your blood pressure is this, your cholesterol level. And then the doctor says, all right, you got to change your diet. Winters, here's what you need to do. I'm going to show you, here's a good diet plan for them. You go to this website. You might do this in 10 minutes. That's a brief intervention. And you can stretch these things out to several sessions. In the drug abuse world, a great 10-minute talk is provided for you on this slide. It's called the pros and cons exercise, or decisional balance. It's where you engage the person to think about why they use, what's the value it has for them, and then you see if you can get them to think about what's the downside to their use. So you don't get into judgment, you don't get into what they use, or other signs of dependence. This is great to engage a person to start to talk. First of all, it's not very threatening. Ask a person, what are the benefits? Why do you like to use? What do you get out of it? Not very threatening. But it's clinically pretty valuable because it tells you what the underlying functional value is of the drug use. And it could lead to a suggestion for what they might want to do differently in their life to address the same problem. And then you ask the negatives because a lot of times people forget about the negatives. And it's always good to make sure you've balanced that against the positives. And even teenagers will give you plenty on the negatives. But the teen brain, of course, is great because it knows the negatives, but the teen brain doesn't necessarily allow that to impact their behavior. It doesn't get to the prefrontal cortex to alter the decision making. But they're smart enough. They don't have cognitive deficits. They'll tell you the negatives. So when we do brief interventions, we have a 3-session plan. We start with this. It's a good door opener, not very threatening. If you go to something called nrepp.samhsa.gov, you can look up evidence-based programs. We found 3 of them that are for teenagers that fit brief interventions. And then intensive treatment are for those that have severe end problems. And I'm going to not spend a lot of time with this. I just want you to reflect that when you get an intensive version of a treatment, you likely are getting a multidimensional exposure to many different approaches. For drug abuse treatment programs that are multidimensional, you are often being exposed or getting exercises and counseling along these various dimensions. You can see it ranges from step work, family work, working on specific skills. This is, I think, in America now, when you see good comprehensive programs, you often see that they will have these core ingredients. Okay, I'm going to skip those. That isn't as interesting. I'm going to go right to number 5. Okay, so treatment's important, but before you do treatment, actually there's assessment. You got to figure out, does somebody have a problem? Is it a little problem or a big problem? And there's a lot of good standardized assessment tools out there for adolescents that have been standardized. A free resource from the federal government, tips number 31, and there's the second one up there is something that's a book. It's a good one that covers the waterfront. So I thought I would at least show you some assessment strategies that are very brief, easy to learn for a wide range of professionals. So I understand in the room we have a lot of nurses, nursing students, wide range of service providers that probably span a lot of different trainings and backgrounds. The head's interview guide is great for all of us in this room. This is where you take these descriptors and you turn them into brief questions. Common sense questions. So, Sally, tell me about where you live. Tell me what it's like at home. So who lives there? How many brothers and sisters do you have? Oh, okay, so your parents. They're married? Okay. Oh, no, you live with just your dad. Well, how often do you see your mom? You get the home environment. Ask about school, activities. Activities, what do you think that means? How do you spend your free time? When you're not in structured activities, how do you spend it? What do you do? That could either lead to or maybe some risk or some assets. Ask about drugs. I'll show you in a minute 6 simple questions you could ask. Sexuality, are you sexual? Are you safe with sex? Are you comfortable with it? Do you have a boyfriend, girlfriend? How's that going? Etc. And a key mental health you always want to ask with teenagers, suicide and depression. It's a high prevalence rate. There's a lot of suicide thinking among teenagers that is not clinical suicidality, but you got to ask. And if you get the red flag answers, you got to drill a little deeper. So, do you have a plan? Have you thought about it? Have you told people about it? Have you been specific? Have you ever tried it? Oh, you did try it. What happened? Why didn't you go through with it, etc. That's if you get a few of the red flag. So what if you want to screen for drugs quickly? There's a 6-item questionnaire that works very well. It's amazing how much accuracy you get in 6 items. CRAFFT. If you want a copy of it, send me an email. I can send you the slide, and you can turn this into a self-report questionnaire, true/false, or you can turn it into an interview. You can put it on a computer. It's public domain. But there's just 6 questions. It's I found out CRAFFT technically is not an acronym. An acronym is supposed to be a word that when the letters are used, it spells a real word, like radar. Radar is an acronym because RADAR stands for the basis for radar. So CRAFT isn't an acronym. It's just 6 letters that are initials. It's a mnemonic to remember. Anyway, well, that was a sidebar, wasn't it? Jeez Louise. But 2 or more yeses is indicative that the teenager has a drug problem. Now, it makes sense to do more assessments, a deeper assessment and inquiry with 2 or more. It's not definitive, but it's quite accurate at 2+. And of course, you got somebody with 5 or 6 yeses. That would be probably quite indicative that they have a severe problem. I'm going to go right to my 6th, my last, which is engaging parents. So the slide says, I attend as many parenting classes as I can, anything to get away from my children. So we try to engage parents a lot in our work, whether it's a standalone project for parents or whether it's incorporating them into the treatment regimen. So parents might be a reasonable cause of a problem, that's true, but to the extent or the detail of their role in the etiology of the teenager's drug use is not as important as getting them on board to help with the solution. And so we spend a lot of time with parents, not worrying about how they might have caused it, but what they can do to help get the teenager back to a drug-free lifestyle. And so it's often the case in family-based programs that you're spending a lot of time working on family communication skills. How can you get the parents to do a better job of communicating with the son or daughter? How can You solve conflicts better, and guess what strategy might be helpful in solving conflicts? Teaching parents how to use motivational interviewing. So we call it arguing fairly, and we got these 6 steps. They all are kind of taking motivational interviewing and steering it into language about how to argue fairly. And a lot of it is telling the parents not to let their emotionality get the best of them. Use your prefrontal cortex. Slow down. Start with a lot of I statements, why you as a parent are concerned, what you see, and what you want to talk about, and what needs to be talked about because there's some issues. And then you allow the teenager to talk, which means the parent gets to listen and not interrupt, even though the teenager might be going off on a wild stream of excuses and et cetera, et cetera. Of course, the teenager might be emotional, and you've got to teach the parent, you have a fully mature prefrontal cortex, right, Mrs. Smith? You've got to do better than your teenage daughter or son. You've got to give them some slack because they don't have the brain development you do. Anyways, and then you end with what the parent and the teenager are going to do to resolve the conflict. And you make sure the parent has to do something, even if it's trivial, but you make the teenager realize and emphasize that, okay, it's not just the Tommy or Sally has to make the change, but the parent's also going to help out or make some changes to as part of the resolution. Parent practices is also a focus. I kiddingly tell parents it's really easy to be a parent. You just have to learn to do 2 things: be supportive and be good at monitoring. And there it is. Do that for 16 to 17 or 18 years, and they'll leave the home well adjusted and happy. Of course, it's more complicated, but one big theme related to support is if a teenager says that they can turn to at least one parent to share or confide in a personal problem, then that probably means that there's very good supportive relationship going on between the parent and the teenager. The parent feels comfortable sharing a personal problem with at least one parent. Very important in a household. It doesn't have to be both, the data says. Of course, good disciplining, being on top of things, and for teenagers, it's reflected in this, where they say, I know my parents would be disappointed if they found out that I broke the house rule or I broke an agreement with them. I know my parents would be disappointed. Teenagers that say yes to that, it's a big asset, and it suggests that there's good monitoring and disciplining in the household. So you want to get parents to be really good at monitoring and support. This is the cell you want everyone to be at as a parent, and all the others are worse. And what's the one parenting probably drifts towards that's not ideal? I think a lot of times they go here. Whoops, I did mean here. Yes, I meant here. Where they lose track of the supportive end of things, and they kick in their parenting mechanisms when they realize, oh, I got to jump on this problem. I got to do some disciplining because things are going wrong. I'm only going to talk to my son or daughter when something has happened, when there's the squeaky wheel problem. And I forget about talking to my son or daughter when it's just time to chat and ask how are things, or to make sure to reward son or daughter for doing something good, even though you think they're supposed to be doing good as a routine. So I think parents drift a little bit too much to here, which isn't desirable. And then the third thing, there's one more, is getting parents to realize that they are important role models in the home with their health habits. So with the drug use phenomenon, it's getting parents to think about what's their relationship like with alcohol and other drugs. Are they abusing alcohol in the home in front of their teenager? Or are they being smart and limiting to 1 or 2 drinks? Do they host parties where adults get drunk? Do they use illicit drugs? Do they abuse prescription, et cetera, et cetera? So getting parents to think about that and impressing upon them the importance of being good role models. I don't know what they're doing in Colorado or Washington with legalization and decriminalization of marijuana. It's probably getting very interesting in homes where now the role modeling is everyone is growing something in the basement and they're all smoking together, and maybe the counselors are just having to convince everyone, well, don't smoke before you drive, or don't smoke before you go to school. it's probably getting quite wacky. So we hand out to parents this, summary sheet, PARENT. Each letter stands for a principle we try to teach them. So 6 principles, and some of them have to do with specific drug abuse, some of them remind them about adolescent brain development. I think the big theme here is, improving communication, support, monitoring, and reminding parents a typical healthy teenager is going to frustrate you at times. So they're going to express boredom, they're going to show emotionality, they're going to want to spend more time with their friends than with you, the parent. They're going to push back on adult rules. Don't look at it as negative. You've got to spin it in your mind as this is a phase. It's actually normal and healthy because my teenager is trying to learn skills that they're going to need to survive when I push them out of them, when they're on their own in adult life. These are adult skills that they're crafting, and it's a little crude in the teen years, but it's their important transition towards individuation. So you got to tolerate the oops behaviors, and that's when teenagers don't always make the right decision. There's excessive emotionality. They push back too often. These are the oops. You got to tolerate that. Save your heavy lifting, I tell parents, for the big things, where they're breaking an important house rule, where they're not showing respect, where they're not taking school seriously, where they're slipping into a bad peer group, etc. Those are the important things. So, to summarize, and we'll open it up. Hopefully I impress upon you, when working with teenagers, think about the many important developmental themes that represent the teen years. And whenever you can, read about what we're learning about teen brain behavior and how that impacts our understanding of teenagers. I forgot to mention, a great book by David Walsh, he's a Minnesotan, called Adolescents, Why Did They Act That Way? And he's written it for both parents and teenagers. And then there's another great one by Anthony Wolfe. And the full title is, Get Out of My Life, but First Can You Drive Me and Cheryl to the Mall? And Wolfe was on to something with that, because that teen brain is screwing up right there. Both of them are very good. They blend a lot of this neuroscience with sharpening parenting practices. So I talked about level of care and adjusting treatment and adapting it, and one way to help with that is good assessment. Good assessment is the key to what you want to really do with somebody, and that is treat them effectively. But you got to do good assessment up front. And there are a lot of evidence-based clinical practices out there, both in the assessment and treatment arena, and use them as best you can. But I'm also a big fan of adapting and adjusting them to fit your client, particularly to fit teenage clients. Okay, thanks for sitting through this lengthy diatribe. I kind of bloviated, I'd be the first to admit. But I want to open it up, and of course I also know people may have to run, so don't feel shy if you have to head out, but if people want to stay and dialogue a little bit, be more than happy to.
Let's first of all give Ken a round of applause.